On the side of this dirt road sits a stone marker, one of many from the banks of the Connecticut River to the shoreline of Lake Champlain. It marks the route of the old Crown Point Military Road built in 1759. The road connected two key locations, Fort No. 4, built in 1735. At the time, it was the northernmost British settlement along the Connecticut River in Charlestown, New Hampshire. From Fort No. 4, the road crosses the Green Mountains of Vermont to Fort Crown Point near the border of New York and Vermont on Lake Champlain. Fort Crown Point was also built in 1759. The road and fort were the plans of General Amherst to maintain British control over the southern end of Lake Champlain against the French in Canada during the French and Indian War. During the 1760 French and Indian War campaign, supplies such as ammunition, troops, and farm animals traveled the road. After the war, it became a major route for central southern Vermont settlers. As time passed, better roads were built, and parts of the Crown Point Road were abandoned. The memory of the road lives on, thanks to groups such as the Crown Point Road Association. Martin Howe, the first president of the CPRA, describes the most memorable aspect of the road. But perhaps the road's most lasting contribution to Vermont's history was its use by settlers in the period between the French and Indian War and the Revolution. The road opened a large area of Vermont for settlement and, with the defeat of the French and the lessening danger from Indian raids, settlers were soon traveling the Crown Point Road and building their homes in the valleys and on the hillsides of Vermont. It is easy to see that the road is a proud historical accomplishment. So how did the British find this route through the Green Mountains? It appears the British only became aware and concerned about the road after an attack on Fort No. 4. During the early stages of the French and Indian War in 1754. A group of Abenakis took captives from the fort to be ransomed in Montreal, Canada. They marched across the same path as the Crown Point Road, then known as the Old Indian Road. This article from the Black River Gazette, published on December 2, 1870, goes into depth about the pursuit of the road to stop attacks from the Abenakis. The attacks continued in 1755. The Indians, instigated by the French, came down from the north and continued their depredations upon the infant settlement, going as far south as Walpole, Keene, and Hinsdale, not forgetting No. 4 on their way. They came and went in parties numbering sometimes as many as 300 or 400. The Indian Road was their most frequented route. In the expedition against Crown Point of this year, a regiment of 500 men from New Hampshire, under Colonel Joseph Blanchard of Dunstable, now Nashua, participated and, according to the admirable history of Dr. Belknap, made a fatiguing march through the woods to Albany. The Abenakis had the upper hand by knowing how to move about the landscape while the British were struggling to find a route across it. The Abenakis knew the land so well because it is their homeland. More specifically, Vermont, eastern New York, northern Massachusetts, parts of Maine, New Hampshire, and north toward Quebec, Canada is home to the Western Abenaki people. The Abenaki became allies with the French in order to stop the approaching British. One of the factors that led to this alliance took place 140 years before the bloodshed of the French and Indian War, when diseases wreaked havoc on the population of the native people of North America. Between 1616 and 1639, 3 disease outbreaks spread through the region, killing nearly 90% of its inhabitants. Historians John Warner Barber and Elizabeth Barber of East Windsor, Connecticut, said this about those devastating diseases in their 1850 book Historical, Poetical, and Pictorial American Scenes. Mortal sickness among the Indians. About the year 1619, just before the settlement of the colony at Plymouth, a mortal sickness or plague swept off the greater part of the Indians along the eastern shores of the United States. In 1619, Captain Durner, an English adventurer, having wintered at an Indian town on the northern coast, sailed southward on his way to Virginia, and landed at several places where he had been before. He found many towns depopulated, and others but few of the natives remained alive, and those suffering from the disease, which appears to have been a kind of plague, as they showed their sores and described those of which their companions died. The mortality among the Indians appears to have prevailed a number of years. In 1622, the Plymouth settlers went to Massachusetts, now Boston, to purchase corn of the natives. They found them afflicted with a great sickness not unlike the plague. It is stated by creditable historians that of the 30,000 Indians composing the Massachusetts tribe, only about 300 were left alive. When the settlers arrived, in 1620, they found the bones of those who had perished, in many places left unburied. At Plymouth, which was formerly a populous place, every human being had died of the pestilence. There appears to be considerable difference of opinion with regard to the nature of the disease which swept off so many of the natives. Some suppose it to have been the smallpox, others, the plague, which raged at this time in many parts of the world, while many suppose it to have been the yellow fever, as it was stated by some of the Indians who survived, that the bodies of their companions who died were exceeding yellow all over before they died, and afterwards. Whatever the disease, it appears to have broken down the spirits of the survivors, to that extent, that for a number of years they made but little opposition to the settlers. The following occurrences relative to this pestilence have been related. A few years before the sickness, a French ship was wrecked on Cape Cod, but the men and cargo were saved. The natives, however, killed all but 3 or 4 of the crew and divided their goods. The men who were spared were sent to one tribe and another as slaves. One of them learned so much of their language as to tell them that God was angry with them for their cruelty and would destroy them and give their country to another people. They answered that they were too many for God to kill. He replied that God had many ways to kill of which they were ignorant. Afterwards, when the great pestilence came, they remembered the man's words, and when the Plymouth settlers arrived at Cape Cod, they feared the other part of the prediction would soon be accomplished. The devastating population collapse is why they chose to fight alongside the French. The choice was necessary if they wanted to hold on to their homelands. The French were only interested in the fur trade and did not intend to create settlements, unlike the British. Knowing how to move about the land that allowed the Abenaki to have an upper hand didn't last long. The British went on to be victorious against the French and Indians. The Abenaki retreated out of Vermont and into Canada, leaving behind their homelands of the last 12,000 years, allowing the British to settle in what would become the independent state known as the Vermont Republic from January 15, 1777, until March 4, 1791, when it became the 14th state of the United States of America. Henry B. Atherton served as captain of Company C, 4th Vermont Infantry Regiment during the Civil War, followed by a career in journalism as the editorial manager of the Telegraph of Nashua. Atherton wrote a report on the old Indian Road for another paper, the Black River Gazette, which was published on August 5, 1870. The report retraces the steps of James Cross, who was hired by the government of Massachusetts to locate a route from Fort Dummer in what is now known as Brattleboro, Vermont, to Lake Champlain. The report is titled, The Old Indian Road. Diary of James Cross, 1730. The journey begins on Monday, April 27, 1730. At about 12 of dock we left Fort Dummer and travailed that day 3 miles, and lay down that night by West River, which is 3 miles distant from Fort Dummer. Nota bene, I travailed with 12 Canady Mohawks that drank to great excess at ye fort and killed a Scatacook Indian in their drunken condition, that came to smoke with them. Their first day's journey was a short one for obvious reasons. A foe familiarly known in later days as his Old Tangle Legs, obstructed the path of James and his companions. Rum, that, 100 years ago blotted out the noblest trait in the character of these Mohawks, their hospitality, and made them kill their guests that came to smoke with them, has not materially changed in the last century and a half, either in its nature of effects, unless it be for the worse. Tuesday. We travailed upon the great river about 10 miles. We kept ye same course upon ye great river, travailed about 10 miles, and eat a drowned buck that night. Thursday. We travailed upon the great river within 2 miles of ye great falls in said river. Then we went upon land to ye black river above ye great falls, went up in that river and lodged about 1.5 miles from the mouth of Black River, which day's travail we judged was about 10 miles. Thus far the distances are tolerably accurate. The great river is, of course, the Connecticut, and the great falls, Bellows Falls. Friday. We crossed Black River at ye falls, afterwards travail through ye woods north-northwest. Then across Black River again about 11 miles above our first crossing, afterwards travailed ye same course, and pitched our tent on ye homeward side of Black River. The falls where they first crossed Black River is, no doubt, at Springfield Village, and 2 or 3 miles above where they encamped the night before. The second crossing place was near Perkinsville, and that they pitched their tent that night on the southwesterly side of the river between the latter place and Upper Falls, and at the base of the eastern extremity of Hawks Mountain. Saturday. We crossed Black River, left a great mountain on ye right hand and another on ye left. Keep a northwest course till we pitch our tent after 11 miles travail by a brook which we called a branch of Black River. The great mountain left upon the right hand after crossing Black River was doubtless a Scutney, while that upon the left was Hawks Mountain. Hawks is named after one of the builders of the Crown Point Road, Colonel John Hawks, a hero of Fort, Massachusetts. Hawks was killed by Native Americans on the mountain that now bears his name. It appears that both men crossed the same path to Hawks Mountain. Hawks Mountain is now a wildlife management area operated by the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation that describes the terrain on Hawks as very steep and rugged. Nonetheless, it was part of the Indian Road. Luckily, that steep and rugged terrain left the mountain untouched by later settlers that left behind parts of the Indian Road. When the British started to settle in the area, they created roads that better served their methods of transportation. The method of transportation for thousands of years of the native people of North and South America was by boat and foot. While Europeans relied on horses and the wheel, 2 methods that are poor at navigating steep and rugged terrain. Cross's journey gave enough pieces of information to help possibly locate the location of the crossing of the Black River, leaving behind the mountain on ye left. This location of the Black River is a long, flat, shallow, easy-to-cross section of the river that travels away from Hawks. From this section of the river heading back towards Hawks Mountain, one is greeted by a large section of a stone wall that is lining a path. Following this path, there's another stone wall. This time the wall goes up the steep and rugged mountainside of Hawks. The path that started near the river seems to be lined by this stonework as it travels up. The path is decayed, overgrown, and at times barely visible. It has been lost to time and forgotten. As predicted by Henry B. Atherton, that line across our territory, traced first by the moccasin of the savage, then more sharply by Hawks, Stark, and Goff, which we have called the Indian Road, is fast becoming obliterated. In a few years, no vestige of it will remain. Atherton underestimated the effect of time on stone. The road is still here. It only needed to be found.
This possible ancient pathway is lined with stonework. A large snakehead-like boulder sits at the beginning of the pathway, across the mountainside. This reptile-shaped boulder could be a serpent effigy, representing a great horned serpent, a type of mythological freshwater serpent found in lakes and rivers, common to many tribes of the eastern United States and Canada. This kind of stonework is not unique to this location. Quite the opposite. It is a common feature found along ancient pathways. They are known as ceremonial stone landscapes, a name given by the United South and Eastern tribes, an intertribal organization serving 33 federally recognized tribal nations. These landscapes often contain features such as dry stone walls, rock piles, stone chambers, unusually shaped boulders, split boulders with stone inserted in the split, and boulders propped up off the ground with smaller rocks. They are found along the eastern seaboard from Georgia to Maine, with the northeast having the majority of these landscapes. Features associated with the ceremonial stone landscapes can be found along this old road, a subject that will be addressed later in this video. For now, let's turn the focus to why this became a road in the first place. This road follows one of the few natural east-west corridors across the Green Mountains of Vermont that connects the Connecticut River Valley that leads to the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Champlain that drain into the St. Lawrence River that also flows into the Atlantic. The natural corridor can be seen here in green, which indicates the lower land elevation. As you can see, both north and south the passage through the Green Mountains is hindered by mountains themselves. Like other ancient roads, the first sign of this natural passageway in use was created by animals. In this case, that is an extinct megafauna. During the construction of a railroad along this corridor in the summer of 1848, workers excavated 11 feet in peat bog and found several bones, a molar, and 2 tusks of a woolly mammoth resting at the bottom of the bog. Recent carbon-14 dating from Dartmouth College of a rib from that mammoth gave results of 12,800 years ago. Vermont looked much different at this time. The Laurentine ice sheet that once covered the land has retreated into what is now Quebec and lined an inland sea that is known as the Champlain Sea. The Champlain Sea was created when the melting ice gave way to the waters of the Atlantic that flowed into the Champlain Basin, which was below sea level at the time due to the weight of the glacials pushing down on it, what geologists call glacial isostatic depression. On the eastern side of this ancient pathway that is today the Connecticut River Valley was a massive glacial lake that formed due to the marine dam made of ice and rock in what today is Rocky Hill, Connecticut. From there, the lake stretched northward to St. Johnsbury area of Vermont. This glacial lake was over 200 miles long and was here from 15,000 years ago until the ice dam broke 12,000 years ago, causing rapid drainage in a few weeks or even a few days. The land between the glacial lake and the inland sea was a tundra, much like what northern Labrador looks like today. Mastodons, giant sloths, giant beavers, stag moose, short-faced bear, caribou, and saber-toothed cats roam the landscape with the Mount Holly mammoth. Belugas, fin and bowhead whales, walruses, seals, and marine shells such as clams are just some of the ocean's life present in the Champlain Sea. The first people that entered this now icy-free land most likely came up the Atlantic Ocean and traveled inland using the waterways as they followed herds of caribou. The earliest known human site on the road is known as Jackson Gore Site, excavated in 2007. There, fluted points of early to middle Paleo-Indian 12,200 to 11,800 years ago were found. The location is on a well-drained vantage point above the natural corridor below. The lithics found at this site came from all across the Northeast. Red chert from Munsungan Lake in Maine, yellow-brown chert from Pennsylvania, showing that people at this time were extremely mobile or had a wide trade network established. This section of Vermont was most likely an established travel route well before the people left before the hunting site at Jackson Gore. One of the earliest known human settlements in New Hampshire is located in the town of Keene. At the time, a short distance from Glacial Lake Hitchcock. Paleo-Americans from this nearby location might have used the natural corridor for easy access across the Green Mountains to the inland sea, which also has lithic site source from far-off location that most likely required some kind of watercraft to reach northern Labrador. It is quite obvious that the Paleo-Americans were capable travelers both across land and water, creating highly skilled lytics from a wide range of source locations, and this natural corridor was an important pathway through the Green Mountains. This area of North America is unique in the fact that, unlike much of the maritime paleo landscapes that now exist under the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, due to the sea levels rising at the end of the last ice age, now free from the weight of the glaciers, the Champlain Basin started to rise, and the seawater was drained out in a process called post-glacial rebound. Many of the Paleo-American sites in this part of Northeast are found along these ancient shorelines, such as these sites along the Champlain Sea. On the other side of the road along the ancient shoreline of Glacial Lake Hitchcock, there is perhaps a different kind of site. The ceremonial stone landscapes in this part of Vermont seem to recognize the ancient shoreline of the glacial lake. On this hill that was once a peninsula, there is a stone row that is easily visible on LiDAR, but hard to see in person. The stone row is covered in vegetation and moss. In certain areas, it is almost completely buried. This stonework doesn't divide property. It's too low to have been used to keep in animals, and the high amount of quartz within is common in ceremonial stone landscapes. Across the Connecticut Valley in what's now New Hampshire, there is another hill that was once an island, and it too has a stone row that contains a high amount of quartz. This row also incorporates bedrock by curving uphill into it. Running across the top of it, and continuing down the slope, ending abruptly above the ancient shoreline. Where the Crown Point Road and Indian Road begins on the western side valley, there is an area where there once is an inlet of the glacial lake. Here, there are stone rows that overlook the now rich soil that has been turned into farmland. The stone rows begin and end on bedrock. This kind of work is what could be classified as a ceremonial stone landscape. It doesn't serve any agricultural needs or divide the land, but it's extremely well built on the bedrock, something a self-sustaining farmer most likely wouldn't take time to create. Not far from the ancient inlet is a longer stone row that is like the one in New Hampshire, begins right at the now gone shoreline. The stonework travels up the small mountain until it reaches a large boulder that looks towards the valley below. Further inland, there is another inlet a short distance above where the glacial waters were. All along the ancient shoreline, there is stonework that seems to be recognizing where the glacial waters once were. Some of this stonework, such as this possible stone mound that has stone row running over the edge of it, is massive. The stonework continues into the mountains. Following along the road, there are many smaller stone mounds. Serpent effigies, standing stones, stone-lined pathways, and chambers with winter solstice alignments. This could possibly be the work of 12,000 years of people using this natural passageway through the mountains until the dispersal of the Abenaki from the area in early to mid-1700s. The vast majority of this work has been credited to the colonial settlers of the mid-1700s. and the sheep boom in the early 1800s, due to the myth that this land was never fully inhabited by the Abenaki. Before the population collapse of the indigenous people of the Northeast, the coastline from Maine to the Carolinas was filled with farms, cleared land, and densely populated villages. The French explorer Samuel de Champlain, which Lake Champlain is named after, wrote in 1609 of those fertile fields of maize in the Champlain and Connecticut valleys. The diseases that destroyed the populations along the coastline moved ahead of the settlers in the 1600s as they took over widowed land filled with skeletons of those that passed from the diseases. The first 50 settlements in New England were deserted indigenous villages. Those same diseases worked their way inland long before the settlers traveled up the Connecticut River. By the time the settlers arrived in large numbers in the mid-1700s, there were hardly any indigenous people present after being forced out of the region into Canada. This allowed the myth of the area of the Northeast was merely a hunting land for native people, which lasted until the 1980s, and it wasn't until 2012 that the state of Vermont recognized the Abenaki that have been here since the end of the Ice Age. Could it be possible that the ancestors of the indigenous people of the Northeast are responsible for creating the stonework that lines this ancient pathway? With the population collapse followed by being forced out of these lands, there were no native people here to say what they did and didn't create. The lack of cultural knowledge has allowed for possible falsehoods about these landscapes to be considered final truths. Until the request for recognition of ceremonial stone landscapes by the 33 tribes of the United South and Eastern Tribes is taken seriously, and these ancient landscapes are properly studied, we may never truly know what secrets and beauty have been lost in time.